bring up Kabbalah at the beginning, since I was having a conversation with Elliot Wolfson, who's also at the center this year, senior scholar who's written at length on Kabbalah, but also in a comparative frame. And I was struck by, in your book, you had this diagram on page 360 by Wali Allah, I
Yeah,
believe.
yeah.
This is in the chapter Sufism and Philosophy. And you had this sort of diagram, and it reminded me of these kinds of sfirot in this, that are arranged in the common tree of life diagrams in Kabbalah. And I was wondering sort of how common are diagrams in the Sufi literature you study? Is this more of a sort of staple foundational feature, or is this sort of more common as kind of a later systematization of these various states and so on? I guess,
Yeah.
where did those diagrams arise, of the self?
So the specific diagrams about the lataif and the self
Mm,
come much slightly later in the classical age, probably. Earlier Sufis, I can't recall seeing diagrams in when it comes to earlier Sufi texts, but it was not unusual, especially among some very well-known Sufis like Ibn Arabi
mm,
or Shah Waliullah we're talking about, and many others. Excuse me, in the Naqshbandi Sufi order, for example. So they act as they're kind of, you can think of them as an aid to a map of your own subjectivity, spiritual subjectivity. And then, yeah, as I said, I was using that metaphor roadmap, but one should not be too literal about it, because there are a lot of people, who by the wheel of sheer technique can,
mm-hmm,
can have, let's use a more Indian terminology, yogic power,
mm-hmm.
siddhi, some kind of, siddhi,
Yeah,
that word.
Siddhi should be in Bengali.
Yeah,
Yeah. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm.
yeah, but sometimes that is not, indicate that does not simply mean that that person has achieved a really great spiritual
Mm-hmm.
station, or and so forth. But it is important, and again, it's not universal. It is found in some Sufism, Naqshbandis, as I said, which also became popular in India, Bangladesh,
Mm-hmm.
and also some Sufis like Ibn Arabi. And you find a lot of these different diagrams to talk about subjectivity, selfhood, subtle centers of consciousness.
Yeah, no, thanks for that clarification and the references. And I want to sort of go into this idea of the roadmap for a second, since in that chapter where you include this diagram of the self, you also say that the end of selfhood is the beginning. And so if the end of the roadmap is also the beginning, people are going around in circles to some degree. And I'm aware from, more of the South Asian context that there is this notion of fanā, or annihilation, as opposed, or sometimes compared with baqā, or this subsistence in God. So I'm wondering, if the end is the beginning, then how is one sort of dissolved or annihilated? Are they reborn? I mean, maybe you could clarify that a little bit from your wide perspective here. Yeah.
Sure. So when it comes to fana, and fana literally means annihilation,
Mm,
and baqā means subsistence, as you're saying.
mm,
But there are different kinds of annihilation, and different
mm,
kinds of subsistence. And sometimes, especially to a modern audience, and by which I also mean modern Muslim audience, these words, well, I should just maybe qualify that a little bit, because it's not just the moderns. Even in medieval times, there were people like Ibn Qayyum, who was a follower of Ibn Taymiyyah, who was still in the orbit of Sufism in some way, but they were kind of opposed to these notions. And in modern times, you have from the subcontinent figures like Muhammad Iqbal, very influential and important figure in the subcontinent. But I've written a lot on Iqbal, and I admire a lot of the things he did. But there are also a lot of, I think, constructive criticism. So one of my criticism is his own understanding of Sufism, because he claimed to draw so much from Sufism, and yet have very negative assessment of some of these terms, key terms. And that mainly occurs because he really did not have a solid, he knew some Persian and Arabic, but not a really solid grounding in classical Sufism, Sufi metaphysics and epistemology. I don't mean just
I
popular
see.
Sufism.
Yeah.
So he was criticizing fanā and baqā, saying, "Oh, this is a disillusion of the ego. If you're dissolved like sugar in water, what is
Mm,
left? This is not Islam. This is it goes against Tawheed, the central doctrine, unity, monotheism." So this is all very superficial.
mm,
Sufis, when it comes to the their like more sophisticated treatments of the ultimate nature of the self. They talk about duality, non-duality, and they are aware that it involves a lot of paradoxes.
mm.
You cannot just talk about it in purely kind of logical, simple logical terms. So fana does not mean a kind of literal dissolution of the ego. That's just impossible. And if there's a kind of total dissolution of your selfhood, your consciousness, then it's there's nothing to even talk about. What happens is that there's a kind of mistaken identity, a kind of double consciousness that develops within the self, if I may use this terminology. Is from the black philosopher Du Bois.
Okay.
Double consciousness
Yeah.
is like looking at the self through the other. From a Sufi perspective, this is what happens with ourselves. What
Mm,
we take to be ourselves is actually the other, but because of our conceptual, representational, whatever, the various factors, we come to believe in an identity that needs to be deconstructed, because that
mm,
is the other, even though we use the I to represent that. But the real I, real self, is something that is beyond our concepts, beyond representations, beyond individuality. Even even yet yet it is somehow within the individual. So it involves a paradox. I really love Lalon in this regard because he's one of the people really who was able to talk about it in a very subtle way through a lot of different metaphors.
mhm,
But this is found in Sufism in different ways. But basically, there is no dissolution. There is, the real self coming to see itself in a way. In a way, the mirror is reversed. We see ourselves in the mirror, imagining
mhm,
a mental mirror, but through fana and baqā, it's kind of reversed. So what happens is there is an annihilation of the kind of everyday self, everyday identity, into the ocean of divine self, into which is understood through baqā, subsistence. So it is a kind of point of view. Fana is always followed by baqā,
mm.
but it is ultimately the same reality we're talking about. So there is really no dissolution, but there does happen some kind of fundamental shift, because now there's a kind of self-realization, who I really am, what the world really is, what is the nature of ultimate reality, which from one perspective completely beyond conceptual, theological, whatever, philosophical explanations. So, so we are in the region of the inexpressible, So that's why it involves a lot of paradoxes. So, from one point of view, if we're looking at it again relatively, from a human point of view,
Mhm.
yes, there is a kind of end, but this end is also the Tila's goal, because it is the
Uh,
beginning. It's the beginning of a from one point of view new life that never ends. But that life has always been there, because the self at that level, the self that we're talking about, it's eternal. It already pre-existed this kind of bodily existence in the world. uh, and so it is very subtle, but from one point of view, there is no beginning and end. There just is. But from our kind of, because we use language and we try to explain to people, yeah, you use different perspectives, even fana and baka. But fundamentally, there's just being, there's just consciousness. Uh, yeah.
yeah, it makes me think of this one line in a Lalon song, Monadite odorchinte, bhasha bakko nahi pave. So, like when the mind or
Yes.
heart is immersed in this sort of primal thought, then there's no more language or grammar.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, Sufis use, if you look at the writings of Ibn Arabi, Kunawi, so many others, they always say when it comes to the ultimate reality, it's beyond definition and beyond description. Rasm and had in Arabic.
Mhm.
beyond imagination explanations. And yet it's immanent because
Mhm.
this is the only reality that sees, quote unquote, sees.
Mhm. Well, based on what you're saying, I'm happy that you are bringing up this notion of the beyond and kind of, beyond what we can perceive. And so, I've been calling Om-gnosis this podcast as the first occult South Asia podcast. And, occult has a lot of meanings that we've been analyzing, but it literally means hidden and can refer to hidden worlds or powers at work in the universe. And even if we sort of don't consider all these modern, intercultural exchanges, between South Asia, Europe, and North America at the moment, I'm wondering if these Sufi teachings are considered occult in some way, and if so, in what ways would Sufi teachings offer a unique perspective on this study, just sort of based on what you've said about this beyond what we can perceive, in terms of the self? Yeah.
Right. So I would say this is again a vast topic, the
Mm.
occult sciences and occult, the phenomenon of the occult in Sufism. So let me again try to outline, the main,
Sure.
yeah, points. So yeah, if you translate, if we understand the occult as simply that which is hidden, then this is precisely the definition of Sufism. Sufism is always concerned with the inner reality, and that
Mm.
also happens to be one of the names of God, al-Batin. God is
Al-Batin.
not only the Zahir, the outward, but also the inward, that which is hidden. And inwardness kind of captures all of this. But historically, if you look at the Islamic tradition as a whole, just like in the modern West or in the West, if you try to write a history of the occult or occultism, you probably can
Mm.
go back to the Egyptians and then the Hermeticism, Hermes, the thrice born Hermes Trismegistus, right?
Correct. Yeah.
And then a new Pythagoreans, new Platonists, and then various phenomena movements during the Middle Ages and down to our times. With figures like Aleister Crowley, perhaps. Similarly, in Islam, there were many phenomena that were called occult or occultism or known as occult sciences that were not directly associated with Sufism, but there are other times when it was deeply connected.
Mm.
So there were terms like al-ulum al-ghariba or al-ulum al-khafiya. These are the translation is the some strange sciences or hidden sciences.
Okay.
So the occult is kind of, it's literally meaning the hidden sciences, one of the expressions, al-ulum al-khafiya.
Mm.
But beyond that, when Sufis talk about the Quran, when they talk about the world, they kind of distinguish between the manifest and the hidden, the
Mm.
outer and the hidden, zahir and batin. But then things get very complicated because Batin, there was also a specific movement which was called the Batiniya, one of the Ismaili Shia Muslims, and so many Sufis, like Ghazali, involved in polemics with them. So that has a kind of negative connotation, the kind of occultist. But then that's not the only meaning of, or that's not the only phenomenon through which you would study the occult.
Sure.
So it's kind of, yes, there were a lot of Sufis who themselves were writing about the occult or were practicing various uh, hidden sciences, al-ulum al-khafiya, like alchemy,
Mm-hmm.
like physiognomy, like astrology, astronomy. These two were deeply intertwined at that time. It was not like the modern astrology, it was way more complex, more mathematical. Anyway,
Sure.
but there were certain figures who were kind of very much known for their contributions to occultism, like the figure of Al-Maslam al-Qurtubi from Spain, 10th century. He is famous for this book called Qayatul Hakim, the goal of the philosopher or the sage,
Yeah.
which was,
Ghayat al-Hakim. Mm-hmm.
I think it was translated into Latin as
The
Picatrix or something like,
Picatrix. Mm-hmm.
yeah,
Yeah.
Picatrix. Yeah. So if you look at Maslama al-Qurtubi and also some of the figures like even Masara and later Ibn Arabi everybody knows from
Mm.
Spain again. So they wrote about the occult sciences or simply the occult in relation to the Quran and various esoteric commentaries of the Quran. So the word esoteric, esoterism, again can mean different things. That's why things get complicated. Is it is it synonymous with the occult or not? But anyway, and then there was the figure of Ahmad al-Buni and
Mm.
his famous book, Shamsul Ma'arif. So again, in some circles he was kind of demonized, especially someone like even Taymiyyah. He always kind of criticizes everybody with whom he disagrees, even though he was in some way Sufi of some sort. But anyway, so those figures, if you look at their writings, it's definitely whether or not they were directly in the Sufi path. They could have been. Sometimes it's not clear, but their writings sometimes are very much in line with the Sufi worldview. There is
Mm.
kind of just no doubt about that. The way they're talking about even microcosm, macrocosm relationships between the outer world and the inner world of the soul. It's kind of exactly the way Sufis talk about. And then during the post-classical period, during the times of the Mughals and the Safavids, as Melvin Kushki especially and others kind of show,
Yes, Matthew. Yeah,
yeah,
Matthew.
Matthew. So the occult was really all over because it served a lot of political purposes as well. So much so that even, excuse me, even a staunchly kind of a philosophical mind like Mir Damad, teacher Mullah Sadra, I think composed something about the occult. Because again, in the Islamic world, when we say occult, it involves Neo-Pythagoreanism, Hermeticism, and a lot of different trends from the Greco-Roman world, and then combined with Sufi teachings. So it's really come up with kind of one broad brush kind of category to describe all
Yeah.
of this. Yeah, but it was something definitely had overlaps with Sufism. And some Sufis were also the practitioners of occult sciences. At other times, it's kind of more the influence is more indirect.
Hmm. Absolutely, and that's one thing that I'm really trying to do on this podcast is make this notion of a cult more pluralistic, right? And I'm happy that you pointed to sort of the difficulty in the broad narratives, versus looking like you have very technically at these sources and their distinctions and nuances, right, with regard to Sufism. So, I'm curious sort of to widen this and bring this into the more contemporary model here. So you really compare in your book this notion of self, or the I, right? The first person pronoun I, with other philosophical models, and that seems to be very much a method or a methodology that you'll use. And I'm really struck by that, and I think it's a very powerful way to talk about the self. But I'm curious, like, do you think that, other critical theorists who have talked about selfhood have missed anything significant by not really considering the Sufi philosophical teachings that you talk about? Since, when I pick up, say your Foucault book on the shelf or anything like that, you're not going to find,
Yeah,
these models of the self that you dive into so eloquently, really. Yeah.
right. No, thank you for that question. So I'll try to be again very brief because this is the subject matter of my book. So
Okay.
I came up with a humble model called the spectrum model because
Mm,
exactly when you study different authors from different cultures, different civilizations, different philosophical trends, you hear very sometimes even outright contradictory things about the self. Sometimes people like Nietzsche or their modern kind of followers, not exactly followers, but counterparts like Dennett and others, they deny that there is something called the self, although Nietzsche's view is more complex. And then Hume also says something similar. Others kind of affirm it, like Carl Jung, Freud. They all had a conception of the self, of course, the subconscious and unconscious in relation to when it comes to Jung. And then,
mm-hmm,
of course, traditional philosophers like Aristotle, Plato, Kant, and all of this. And then, of course, other. Yeah. So, how do you make sense of something as fundamental as this, like the self, which is so crucial? Excuse me, when it
mm-hmm,
comes to addressing the question of what it means to be human in a secular, globalized, post enlightenment world. So I thought of coming up with a model that would be able to capture some of the nuances and also allow us to study the self globally and not just kind of ethnocentrically, not just from a kind of narrow cultural perspective. So, in my to give two concrete examples, Foucault was discussed in my book in respect to social constructionism and what I call in my model sociocultural self.
mm,
And also, he is relevant, although I haven't discuss him in detail when it comes to what I call ethical and spiritual selves, because he
I see.
does deal with these issues in the history of sexuality and his book on subjectivity, and also in other places. So there's definitely the part which we call constructed. So postmodernists are often at pains to kind of explain how what we call the self is actually something constructed. There's no fixed essence. It's like human beings are with they're born with a minimum biological substratum, and then basically it's everything else, your socio-cultural genetic makeup factors, language, culture, whatever, they kind of give you the illusion of a self, by
Sure.
which it's all constructed ultimately. And only oftentimes it so happens that as this French sociologist, I think Latour, who passed away recently, as he was kind of making a parody of some of these social constructions. Nobody is able to kind of figure out these illusions. Only those people who study kind of sociology, anthropology, in a through a kind of through a very through a specific lens, they're able to figure out this construction is the fact that the self is a construction, and the fact that all this there's nothing kind of grand, nothing even spiritual about the self. So I agree that society, social constructionism does play a role. It's very obvious. We all kind of share in various collective identities. We identify sometimes as Americans, Europeans, Muslims, Bangladeshis, whatever,
Mm-hmm.
and they all mean something collectively. But they don't answer deep, more subtle philosophical, phenomenological questions of reflexivity, and also our spiritual aspirations. So their self has to be multidimensional. And then I also point to neuroscience and various other cognitive sciences. They're all important when it comes to the biophysiological dimension of the self, which I discuss at length. But
Mm-hmm.
they don't talk about our aspirations as human beings, which is as real as these other scientific, which I call again descriptive. There's a distinction I made, very crucial one, descriptive and normative. So we selfhood, being a self is like it's like a work in progress. You cannot exhaust its reality just through descriptions, just through sociological or scientific descriptions, because fundamentally there's the you know desire, there is a kind of impulse on our part to be something good, to aspire to be something, to be our authentic self, even if we want to be an ordinary person. Even then we do have some kind of aspirations, let's say as an ordinary self. So you cannot simply avoid that part. So let's explore what this other part involves, philosophical, phenomenological, and then connected to it, spiritual and ethical. So definitely, I mean, it's also paradoxical that if I compare Sufism with postmodernism on some very general level, there are actually some interesting overlaps. Sufis are also trying to refute the idea that there is like a fixed, essence. They're also against kind of essentialism, because that limits the self. Remember earlier I talked about how we look at the real self through the other. What we take to be ourselves as an I is
Mm-hmm.
really the other, because this is the notion of so and so Muhammad with whatever other educational qualifications, cultural characteristics, physical appearances, this way, that way, whatever. These are all kind of, yeah, if people try to define themselves through these, then they are reverting to some kind of essentialism, which needs to be deconstructed. And yeah, so but Sufis are saying ultimately there is an ultimate reality, there is the infinite. So and so selfhood ultimately kind of converges. There is a kind of direct relationship between the our finite conception of ourselves and the image of the infinite that we have. So Sufis are trying to remake their self. So there is also a kind of self creation, which postmoderns and others talk about. But the difference is, for postmoderns, there is no kind of real transcendence beyond the psychophysical realm. But for the
Mm-hmm.
Sufis, there is the spiritual and intellectual realm, and they have their reasons all the way going back to Plato. and other philosophers. Like, how do you make sense of your intellectual, philosophical concepts and mathematical concepts, and so many other reasons. Anyway, I would say yes. From a certain point of view, definitely people are maybe missing something deeply, perhaps important, like concepts of conceptions of love and beauty, aesthetics. You can always argue there can be secular versions of those. Foucault and others talk about it. Definitely, I don't discount that. I think that's much better than something like a crude materialism, which you see among some biologists or physicists.
Hmm.
But yeah, at the end of the day, Sufis are talking about experience, real experience. It's not just concepts. So there, I think there will be some differences.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, in the conversation of experience, I think your description there, which was really great, taking us through that, it allows us maybe to go into a song to close this discussion here. That really shows, I think, this idea of what you're talking about more from this practitioner experiential perspective. And so you mentioned Lalon a few times at the beginning, this poet from the 19th century who lived near what is today Kushtia, Bangladesh. And so he has this one song, and your work reminded me exactly of this song. And it's the first line is Ami kitai janile shadon shiddi hoy, and I'll just read the translation really quickly that I've made, and then and ask you sort of, what you think of this in the light of your own work, right? Given the broader perspective of Sufism that you have, and so it starts out. Lalona is saying, "What am I? If or when that is known, then my striving or sadhana will be complete." Siddhi. The meaning of the word
Exactly.
I is profound. In me there is no more I. In the endless market of the city they shout I, not thinking about my own I. I read scripture like a madman or crazy person. This Mansur Halaj fakir had said, "I am the truth, Amishotto." This is approved as the Swami's law, but can its meaning also be found in the Sharia? By my will arise, by God's will arise. I think the Arabic is kumbezni la. The Lord's command is that these two eyes be temporary partners, hilla. Lalon says this riddle is revealed at the teacher or Murshid's abode. And so I sent you the song in advance, so you're not on the spot fully here. But when you read the lyrics, I'm wondering how your philosophical expertise and deep forays into Sufi context allow you to appreciate this really great play on the pronoun I, right, in Bengali ami, and how it's used in the song and in Sufi context more generally.
Wonderful. Yeah, I think it will help us to kind of summarize everything that has that we discussed so far. And but allow me to say some background information about Lalon, because I follow what's going on in today's Bangladesh, and I can see that Lalon is still very relevant. He's relevant to people like Farhad Mazhar and others. Whereas there are also people who think Lalon's legacy is very controversial. They don't consider Lalon as part of Islam. So there are all these debates, and I'm not going to go into the debates of who is right and who is wrong, because Lalon seems to have kind of Muslim followers who claim they are Muslims, but he also has followers who would not identify themselves as Muslims. And when it comes to Lalon's own identification, again, his biography, very little is known, as we all know. But it was a lot of commonly people just talk about his conversion to Islam because he was found by a Muslim family, and then he had Shiraz Shai, as his Sufi teacher. So, and when he was asked about his own identity, and he answered this to his poem, and if I just paraphrase it, he used the word Jat to talk about like who he is. He said, why do you ask this meaningless question? I mean, I'm just paraphrasing.
Hmm.
I mean, you can't simply answer this question by ticking the box whether I'm Hindu and Muslim anyway. So he kind of intentionally, I believe, left it kind of quite, um, you know, unclear, ambiguous, because he knew, as I was trying to explain again and again, there's a kind of double consciousness when it comes to our self-identity. We use representation concepts. We use the word I to refer to actually something which is actually the other, what we take to be. So that's why, I know that you have written about Lalon and you are a scholar of Lalon. But yeah, I when I read Lalon, it resonates with me, with my own metaphysical beliefs about self-identity and how I understand selfhood in Sufism as well. Because so one of the things that Lalon scholars normally don't discuss much is how deeply you have to be versed in Sufi conceptions of self-knowledge. Because if you're familiar with Rumi, Ibn Arabi, Hafiz, and so many other great Sufi poets, philosophers, it's amazing how Lalon was able to kind of, you know, familiarize himself with all of these teachings and then add a further layer to it, because he was also drawing on other traditions. But again, I told you, like, this is not entirely new. Darashiko, much before him, declared that Sir Akbar Upanishads are the kind of the secrets of the Quran, while remaining a Muslim. Yeah, so and Abdul Latif Sindhi, if you read, Risalo, written in Punjabi, I think. So he's such a famous, like Lalon in Punjab, in Sindh. So they're talking about yogis, and much before these figures, there are other Sufis talking about the overlaps between Sufism and yogic philosophy, and how when it comes to real yogis, they're muwahidun, or the true monotheists. So what Lalon is doing from one point of view is nothing deeply unique. But from another point of view, he's doing it in Bengali and adding his own experience. But his poems are so profound and they speak directly to what I was trying to explain, like the puzzles, enigmas surrounding our identity. Who am I? And so this poem, I found the Bengali version as well. So it's completely in line with the way I make sense of, as I said, Sufi metaphysics when it comes to self-knowledge, and also something deeply experiential. So the very first verse, "Ami ki thai janle shadon siddhi hoy, ami shabder orthothari, ami she to ami noi." I mean, this is exactly what I was trying to say, like double consciousness. Ami she to ami noi.
Mm.
The ami, the I that I take as myself, the ordinary outward I, it's not the real I. Ami Shabda October, it's the real I is its meaning is extremely profound, and you achieve realization, complete ma'rifah, or fanā and baqā, only when you come to know the real spiritual metaphysical meaning of the I. And then he goes on to talk about Mansur al-Hallaj, the famous Sufi who was put into the gallows because he made the utterance, al-Haq in Arabic, I'm the truth. Haq is one of the names of God. But as the scholars have shown, there are political reasons why he was murdered. And after Hallaj, there are so many other Sufis like Ain al Qudad, like Rumi, even there are so many other, even Ghazali, who sort of justified the meaning of this, but they were actually deeply respected. So we have to understand the political context, and we also have to understand that Sufis, by and large, are in complete agreement with this statement, because they always make this fundamental, crucial distinction between the everyday, ordinary I, the
Mm.
constructed identity that social constructionists, Foucault, and others are rightly criticizing, and the real I,
Mm.
which grounds this appearance, this apparent and outward I. So the whole idea of Sufism is to kind of come to terms, come to see our true face. And Lalon uses the word ochin paki,
Mhm.
strange bird, and also moner manush, like these kind of phrases, using the word human, the kind of the inner human, which is kind of hidden within us. So referring to that reality, which ultimately is beyond concepts, as Lalon himself says. Um, so he was saying that someone like Hallaj has expressed that truth, but then those who just follow the literal meanings, especially understand Sharia very literally. Again, it's a vast topic, and from today's perspective, I see a lot of confusions around the term Sharia and Hakika.
Mm.
Hakika meaning truth, in the goal of Sufism. People kind of see it in a very legalistic way. But if you look at how Sharia was defined by someone like Shah Waliullah, who was well respected both as a jurist, both as also as a Sufi. So he's someone equally respected, or people from Dewan like Ashraf Ali Thanvi,
mm,
someone deeply respected by the kind of even people who tend to follow sometime a literalist understanding. But this same person was also a very well-known, respected Sufi. But so if we look at their writings, their explanations of the Sharia is actually different. So, but the criticism that Lalon has is for those people who are kind of defining the Sharia in a very narrow, literalist way.
mm,
And from that perspective, you leave no room for this ultimate truth, ultimate meaning of life.
mm,
Life becomes just a kind of, robotic, just following rituals, which has been criticized in all mysticism. Vedantins criticize ritualistic
mhm,
mentality,
mhm,
and it's in Kabbalah, it's in in Christian mysticism too. Those who the nomos and eros,
mhm,
kind of, yeah. So this is actually very subtle. So from a kind of legalistic point of view, we can never understand, never make sense of why someone like Hallaj said, "I am the truth." Because this eye was not his eye, it was already God's eye.
mm,
And so Hallaj did not kind of do it on purpose in a way. Like if someone makes that statement as an ordinary human being, of course that person is committing a grave sin, shirk in Islam, and he should be, or they should be condemned. But here that was not the issue. Everybody understood what he was referring to. But still it's kind of really, really, if not impossible, really difficult for yeah, the legalistic literalists to kind of make sense of this. And then this poem has so much, like, when it says kum bi idhnillah, again, that's the thing. When it comes to contemporary Lalon scholarship, people, unfortunately, they are not versed in the kind of deep Perso-Arabic tradition that was in India, Bangladesh for centuries, because those were
sure.
also the language. So in many, I've checked the different versions of this poem, and
Mhm,
I saw that many people, when they transcribe those words in Bengali, kumbi idhnillah and kumbi,
mhm,
they just didn't understand the Arabic words. And
sure.
Lalon's oeuvre, his poems, his poetry is full of subtle, many of these very subtle Arabic and Persian terms.
Mm,
So it shows that even without kind of traditional training and in formal education, there must have been a kind of deep, profound oral tradition with which he was familiar. Otherwise, how come he is able to make use of some of these expressions and also concepts that you can only find in high Sufism, what some people would say high Sufism, not the kind of popular Sufism. So yes, if you just pinpoint that particular line, Kumbidni and Kumbidnillah, what is the mystery? One is with the permission of God, one is by the permission of Bidni, if it was referring to self. How is the two sort of intertwined? And how it is that only your guru can, unveil this riddle. This is so profound because there is a mystery. Even Narbi and others talk
mm,
about it. Like when it comes to human actions, ultimately there is a mystery on some level. So I don't want to get into kind of even more controversial discussions, but yeah, it all comes down to the way we understand and use the word personal pronoun I.
mm,
It's both the self and other. In my book there were many sentences which appear as paradoxical, like the self is now no longer the I, it's kind of the other, but it's also the individual. So it involves a paradox because this I ultimately is none other than the true I. That's why Sufis say whoever knows himself knows his Lord. But
mm,
who is this I? Sufis have written many poems, and especially in the subcontinent, Bulle Shah, Abdul Latif Sindhi, so many others. There's so many great poems about this. This is for me the ultimate riddle, and I just don't want to provide a final answer because it's something everybody has to experience it for themselves.
Yeah, I think it's better not to sort of provide a final answer right in this context, and even with so many variants of these songs as well. So in the variant that I first heard sung and recorded by, his name was Shadu Humayun Fokir. He actually had this line. It's amate ar aminai in the second
Right, right.
line, and so it's interesting that like there's the I, and then there's also the not I as well
Yeah,
that you
yeah,
explore in your book so much, and
yes.
and and, and that interplay becomes so important. So Yeah. Any final thoughts on the not I before we
Yeah, I think we
uh,
talked a great deal about the
conclude?
eye. So
Yeah.
the final thoughts, definitely the not I is
Yeah.
also within the eye, and it's so important in an age where we are constantly bombarded with news about climate disasters,
Mm,
because we have come to develop a very narrow notion of individualism where everybody defines themselves as if they're an island completely separated from other islands and other. But Sufis are ultimately talking about oneness,
mm,
interconnectedness, and this is deeply related to also Tawheed in Islam. But Sufis take it to the next level, the esoteric level, the hidden level, you might say. So I think it has all these social, cultural implications in our age. Trying to define ourselves not through just some kind of Cartesian introspection, just by diving into yourself, which is, it gives you some clue about who we are, but then also see the reflections of the I in the not I, which is everything else.
hmm Yeah, I think that's a perfect place to leave it there. And so, thank you so much, Dr.
You're
Muhammad
welcome.
Farouk, for your time, and we look forward to seeing how people respond to your interview, and hopefully we can facilitate some kind of ability for people to be in touch with you or to contact you, if they have further questions as they engage your rich body of work. So, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was really a great conversation, and I really enjoyed it. And we'll be in touch, definitely.
Sure, yeah. Malateko.
Neo.